Hey Castle Club, welcome back to Castle Creations. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make a delicious treat with a very few ingredients. So the first things we're going to need are pie dough. So this is just some pie dough that I've rolled out into a thin layer. You can use store-bought, you can use homemade, and if you don't have any recipes or if you don't want to go to the store, you can use the homemade pie dough I made in one of my last videos, which is what I'm using right here. You are also going to need a rolling pin, a pizza cutter. If you don't have one of these, just use a knife, but this makes it easier. A pastry brush. You can just use your fingers. All we're doing with this is rubbing butter on the dough, and that part is optional too. We're going to need a bowl, a cup, a spoon, and now for the ingredients. We're going to need some melted butter. It can be hot, it can be cold, it doesn't really matter. Some powdered sugar, some milk, some sugar, and some cinnamon. We don't have exact measurements in this video. Like the butter, it's not, you don't need an exact amount. It just can be a good sized chunk of butter. Okay, now let's start making. I'm going to take my pizza cutter and I'm just going to start slicing the dough into small slices like this. You can make them smaller or larger or whatever, but I just like to make mine into thin strips. And they don't have to be perfect either. We're gonna be rolling them out again soon anyway. And then just go the other way and make good sized strips. We're most likely gonna be cutting them again, so it doesn't matter how small they are. Okay, now the next step is to get rid of any small chunks like this that you just totally can't bake, or just like pieces like this. These won't bake evenly. So just all the corner pieces, all the tiny broken off pieces, stuff like that. You can just shape it into a ball. You can either throw this away or re-roll it out and make a couple more crisps. Okay, now we're just gonna put all of these and just a pile to the side. I'm doing this all in parchment paper, it makes it so much easier. You can do this on a counter, but make sure you put flour on it and don't use too much or else it gets sticky, or if you use too much, it just doesn't cook right because you have way too much flour in your dough. I'm just moving all of these out to the side. Nothing super important. Anyway, once you have this done, you are going to grab a slice or two. So I'm gonna use these couple slices right here. And you're gonna take your rolling pin. Gotta clear a little more space first. And use these two slices. So you're gonna take your rolling pin and just roll over them to make a couple more times to make them super flat. Because if they're too thick, they won't cook right, and then you'll just end up getting super weird, chewy bite thingies. Our goal here is cinnamon sugar crisps, not chewy dough. And if they get too big, like this one, we're gonna end up cutting it again, and you can just flip it over, roll it on the other side. A couple more times. Okay, now this is about the the thickness you want it to be. Otherwise, it will get overly crispy and it will burn. So now I'm just gonna cut these a little bit smaller and set them off to the side. You're just gonna keep doing that until you have all your crisps rolled out. So you can do 2 or 3 at a time. I wouldn't recommend more because it gets hard to control and some will be too thick and some will be too thin. It gets really problematic. And also, if you find yourself making them too thin, just re-roll them up and cut them again and start over. And just flip these over. Roll a bit more on the other side. And cut. You don't have to cut them too small, just like this big. You can even cut them before if you feel like it to make them smaller. And make sure you keep the ones that you've already done separated from the ones that you need to do. Otherwise, you can make them too thin or too thick or whatever. I'm just putting these all in a corner just to save space. Okie dokie. Just keep rolling these out. Sorry, that was my spoon. Also, if your rolling pin gets sticky and they keep getting stuck, you can rub a little flour over it, but don't do too much or else you'll have a really chewy mess. So anyway, I'm just gonna keep rolling and rolling until I have all these crisps done. And when you're rolling out your dough, if you're making the homemade dough, when you're rolling out your dough, it can get really hard sometimes, and you might need a parent's help. So and make sure when you're putting these to the side to spread them out a little bit, because they'll get stuck together and then you'll have to re-roll them all again. And this one kind of fell apart, so I'm just gonna add it to my scrap ball. So, as we're rolling, I'm just going to explain the next step. Once you're done, you are going to start by buttering them. You really don't have to do that step. It's optional. If you don't like too much butter, or if it's way too salty or whatever, then I would recommend not doing it. Then I would recommend not buttering it. But if you're that kind of person that loves the buttery goodness, then you can add some, I just melted some unsalted butter in the microwave, nothing fancy. And you can just lightly brush it over your little pie crusts. And I'm adding a couple more chunks to my big ball. And rolling out the next few slices. slice them again. Only a few more left to go. I'm just rearranging these again because they get kind of stuck together and you want to save as much space and try not to roll over them again. So anyway, we're going to do our next. I'm going to do 3 slices this time. And just press down. Make sure not to press down too hard or it will get really stuck to your rolling pin. And it's really hard to try to get off and it just turns into a ball of sticky dough again. And only a couple rolls, just like 2 or 3 rolls back and forth is good. They really don't need to be rolled out that much. And if you can get it thin enough before you cut it, then you don't have to do this step, but I find this makes it crispier and way more delicious. So only about 9 more pie crisps to do. I'm going to do 3 at a time again. Actually, I'll try 4 this time. Okay, that's pretty good. And if you end up making really big slices, you can even cut them into 3rds or 4ths, but I just typically cut mine into halves because it's easier and smaller. Okay, now I'm going to do the last of my crisps. Get them spread out on the parchment paper. And last time. Okay, perfect. Now, I'm going to brush mine with butter because I find that it makes it quite crispier, but of course you don't have to. And I'm just using my little pastry brush right here. And I'm going to take my melted butter and just dip the brush in and just like, basically you're just painting the dough. Make sure you get to every little slice, so I like to go in a pattern, just row by row. And it doesn't have to be a lot. I'm adding quite a bit. You don't have to add as much as me, I just like it. Only a few more. Okay, 6 more to go. 3, 4, 5, and 6. For the next step, I'm just going to take my small bowl that I had gotten, my small green bowl. And then I'm gonna add about 3 tablespoons of sugar. If you made a batch big like mine, you can add a little bit more. And then I'm gonna take my cinnamon and add just like maybe 3 shakes of cinnamon. 2, 3. And then next you just mix that with your spoon or your hand even. And if you like it to be more cinnamony, that's not a word, but you know, you can add a little bit more. Also, if you do have cinnamon sugar in your pantry, it's the same thing, you're just saving a step. So I added just a little bit more sugar just because this looked like it wasn't going to be quite enough. Now, the reason we put the butter is A, because it makes it crispier, but B, it helps the cinnamon sugar to stick. So I'm just sprinkling this over the crisps. It doesn't have to be very much. You can add as little or as lot as you like. Just make sure you get every crisp, so go row by row again. And in case you missed one with butter, just look over them. If it has like a shiny gloss, then it has butter, but if it doesn't, you probably missed it. This is actually a family recipe. Most of the time, I just make it with leftover pie crusts. Like when I make apple pies or strawberry pies or whatever, I use it with the leftover pie crust. But I just decided to show you guys how to make it. And it's really simple too, and it only takes like 10 minutes to bake. So, yeah. I'm just rinsing my hands off because it gets kind of messy. And if you're just baking it at 350, so you can preheat your oven whenever. But you can just start smashing some of that sugar down. You can add a little more if you like. Just depends on what kind of stuff you like, how sweet you want it. And also, if you make my pie dough, I recommend that you use a little less salt or a little more sugar, because that pie dough is usually for sweeter stuff, and so it balances out the sugar with the salt. So after I've gotten it all kind of squished in, I see that there are a couple that look like they need a little bit more. So I'm just going over it, sprinkling it again. And that's done. You can save your leftover sugar. You don't need it, or you can just pour it in the touch. So now you're gonna need a baking sheet, just like a small baking sheet. You can use a big one. I just like to use a smaller one. And then all you have to do is line it with some parchment paper. Don't use wax paper. Sometimes the wax melts depending on what type you're using, and it makes the food taste weird. But I'm just lining it with some parchment paper. Now you are going to start putting your crisps onto your sheet. They don't have to be very far apart because they don't have eggs in them, which means they don't expand as much. So maybe a couple centimeters. They really don't have to be far. And if a couple pieces break while you're picking it up, that's okay. They can go in your scrap pile, or you can just throw them away, or you can even just make them into a deformed crisp. They don't have to be even in rows either, because you see mine are all different sizes, so they're just kind of going in a weird pattern. Just gonna get all the little crisps. You may need you may make 3 or 4 batches, or you may need a couple of pans if you're baking with a lot of pie dough, but you can just fill up one tray and then take another tray too. I think I may be able to fit all mine on one tray because I only made a small portion today. You want to try to fit as many on as possible. If you can't fit them all, that's okay. But it's easier. Takes a lot less time if you can arrange them in a way where you can fit them all. Only 4 more. Okay. Now, I'm just gonna take all my leftovers. I'm gonna throw it away because I already have so much, but you guys can re-roll it and start the process over again if you don't want to waste any. Now I have all of my crusts onto a pan, and you can add a little bit more cinnamon. I add a little bit more cinnamon at the end. Oops, I spilled a little there. Just in case I didn't add enough before. You don't have to do this part, of course, but I like to add a little bit more. You can just rub it in between your hands. That way it gets everywhere. And I like to do this part when they're already on the sheet, so the cinnamon kind of just stays within the pan, because it can get kind of messy, trust me. Just rubbing all of this. And make sure you did wash your hands first before you do this, because you don't want to get germs all over your food, of course, and especially right now in COVID. Don't want to get anyone sick if you're sharing these. Okay, now I've got to wash my hands because they've turned cinnamony. Now that that's finished, you can just close some of your ingredients. Okay, so our next step is going to be to bake these, of course. And I just put them in the oven for 10 minutes to make them nice and crispy. And then You can add 1 minute intervals based on how crispy you want them. Mine take 13 minutes in my oven, but that may not be yours, so you want to be careful before you add too much time. So I'm going to set my timer for 10 minutes. And while that is going, we're going to make the delicious glaze that you have to dip it in. You don't have to, but it's absolutely delicious. So, for this, all we're going to need is some powdered sugar, some milk, and a spoon. You can put all your other ingredients away and your baking supplies away, whatever you had out. Okay, so the first step to this is going to be to add the powdered sugar. You want to do the powdered sugar first because you want the milk to dissolve into it and not it to dissolve into the milk, because I don't know why it makes a difference, but it does. So about 3 spoons. You can add more. It doesn't make very much. So if you're looking for enough to cover all of the crisps, you're gonna want like a half to a whole cup of powdered sugar, and then some milk. This has no exact measurement because this is just a really simple recipe with no measurements needed. So I added about 4 spoons, just enough to make for me. And then you can start by adding 1 spoon of milk, come on, milk, and then just stir it until it gets kind of liquidy, but you want to get all the powder first. And you see this doesn't make very much, so that's why you want to use a lot. So this is just enough for a couple pie crisps, basically. And finally, when you're done, the pie crisps look like this. They're just delicious, crispy little bites. And you can dip them in the glaze, you can eat them plain, you can dip them in a chocolate, whatever you want. Anyway, thank you for watching. See you next time on Castle Creations. Please like, subscribe, and hit that bell.